Thank you so much for joining this session. This is going to be our 37th session of the Knowledge Series. I want to introduce myself and TCAE to many of you, or if this is the first time that you're hearing about the TCAE. My name is Suzan Ismaili, and I'm the founder of the TCAE, which is in short Toronto Compliance and AML Events. I have been in the field of compliance and financial crime for the past 15 years. And education and informing and sharing it, it's actually a passion of mine, and as well a passion of TCAE. So we created TCAE so that we can connect, inform, educate, and empower all our compliance and AML professionals around the world. And so this is who we are, and this is our aim. And we are striving to do that. And since last year that we started the Knowledge Series sessions, we have a lot of enthusiast professionals who came into our sessions every other Saturdays, and before we had every Saturday last year. So we have been doing this from last year, and almost 7,000, more than 7,000 professionals from 80 different countries have signed up and joined these sessions. So we are so excited that this has been a famous series that attracted many of you from all over the world. So that's awesome. With that, today is an amazing session I can tell you about. I know Ross and Kim, and they never disappoint. They are absolutely amazing professionals. They're both favorite speakers of mine, absolutely knowledgeable. Ross is actually amazing. He has been an attorney and expert witness, and he's based in US. And we have Kim Manchester, who you don't need much of introduction, and he's absolutely amazing, and you have seen him on many of our sessions as well before, and he doesn't also need an introduction, but I will give the floor to them so that they can also give a bit of background about themselves and tell more about who they are, what they have been doing. And so yeah, I will give the floor to Ross and Kim to introduce themselves and take on the session.
Suzanne, thank you so much. Thank you so much for inviting us, for introducing us, for moderating, for organizing. I've never had 5,000 views of an announcement of a session before, as I did with your session, which is a tribute to the incredible network you've built up. I can sum up my experience in just a few words. Somebody once said, it might have been Kim Manchester, you know so much about so little, and so little about so much.
It's true.
And I really thought that summed up. It was one of the greatest compliments I've ever been given, and it just sums up my expertise. Kim?
I agree. I know very little, and that's why I've written very little.
So let's talk about trade-based money laundering as long as we're here. I mean, what the heck?
Why not? What is TBML, Ross?
Well, it could be any one of a number of things, including underpricing, which means that the buyer gets more than he or she bargained for, and therefore value being shifted to the buyer, or the other way around, overpricing, where the seller gets more than he or she should, and therefore value shifted to the seller. There's also false invoicing, where the quantity or quality is misstated, again, as a way of shifting value. And then there's my favorite, because it actually happens a lot, ghost or phantom invoicing, where there's no export or import, but simply used as an explanation for a wired transfer. So for example, a SWIFT message might say, this is in payment for invoice number 4362, but in reality, nothing was shipped. Kim, have you experienced any of these types of TBML?
I have, and these are indeed the four main themes of TBML.
Great. And then because the FATF 40 recommendations, I hope you all know about them. These are the international standards in AML CFT, anti-money laundering, countering the financing of terrorism, and also countering the financing of weapons of proliferation. So how many cover trade-based money laundering? These FATF recommendations have been around for 30 years now, and the answer is none.
None.
Kim?
The answer is none. It says right there.
Okay, thank you for reading it. These dates are the dates of the various iterations of the FATF recommendations. Americans say FATF, Europeans say FATFA. I don't know what they say in Canada.
We say irrelevant government bureaucracy that distorts competent anti-money laundering and anti-terrorist financing.
Okay, good. Canada's been a member of the FATF from the beginning. And a word about 1990, which is, and if you have any questions as we go, please type them into the chat box and Suzanne will read them to us. I've asked her to interrupt because Kim never stops talking and therefore she has to interrupt.
Wow.
Right, Kim?
Wow.
So in 1990, the first round of the FATF recommendations, there's a funny comment here. I wonder what Kim calls FinTrack, but
a valued client, Ross, a valued client.
Okay. So in 1990, the first round of FATF recommendations were issued, 40 recommendations, but they also issued their first annual report because the group itself had been formed in 1989. So by 1990, they'd been in business for a year. And in that annual report, very hard to find, but I did find it, it says that one of the problems in money laundering is intra-company transfers where the prices are manipulated. And that is a form of trade-based money laundering, which 30 years ago they pinpointed. Since then, many, many discussions of it.
Yeah, but that's transfer pricing. They were getting towards transfer pricing, but inadvertently getting towards TBML.
Well, it could be both. I agree.
Yeah.
It could be both. That's right. Because of course, money laundering has to have the origin of the funds has to be illicit, whereas transfer pricing presumably not the case.
Correct.
FATF has said that trade-based money laundering is one of the three main avenues to launder money. The other two are heavily covered, or at least expressly covered, by the FATF recommendations. So for example, the use of the financial system, we all know there are all sorts of recommendations. And then there is one particular recommendation on cash couriers requiring declaration or disclosure when over a certain amount of cash is carried across borders. I happened to be in Bermuda at one point years ago, and the authorities told me, well, the crooks have discovered a way around this cash courier business. They just write checks and they carry checks back and forth. So the two main avenues, and yet the third main avenue, according to FATF, is trade-based money laundering, but no consensus, therefore nothing in the recommendations. And while there's nothing, the ships that carry the containers are getting larger and larger, and so large, wait a minute, what happened there? That the largest can carry 21,000 containers. The ship that got caught in the Suez Canal was carrying close to 21,000 containers. These are big things here. So the numbers are huge, and yet the containers themselves pose all sorts of threats. Human trafficking via container. You could conceal terrorists that way. Potential entry of weapons of chemical, biological, or nuclear weapons or materials could be that way also. Kim?
Well, statistics, it was publicly revealed during a presidential debate by John Kerry many years ago that 5% of containers are inspected upon entry into the United States. But since then, Mr. Delston, you and I have learned that that's not necessarily the case.
Sorry about that. It is not the case at all. No, we're going to get to that in a minute. So are the statistics accurate? And here's the answer. A ship broken in half. Now, why is this the answer? Because it's a great photo? Yes. But also because the shippers, the exporters, the companies that are putting the containers on the ship don't always declare the weight correctly. And sometimes, not often, the excess weight causes the container ship to break in half. Doesn't happen very often, but the statistics themselves are clearly, here's another one about breaking in half. I just have to say, these are great.
Can I throw something in there, Ross?
Please.
So back in 2005, I was retained by the Department of Finance in Ottawa to help two Canadian economists write the FATF white paper that was released in 2006 on trade-based money laundering. And the two economists went around on a fact-finding tour to talk about TBML with various entities. And they went out to the port of Halifax. And they were talking to Canada Border Services Agency officers on trade-based money laundering. And they wanted to ask them, they wanted to see examples of the goods in a container not fitting the description on the paperwork, bill of lading or what have you. You know, does that happen? And the CBSA officer said to them, he goes, yeah, all the time. You can open up a container filled with scrap metal and the bill of lading says it's very expensive, fancy electronics. And one of the economists said to the CBSA officer, well, then what do you do? And the CBSA officer says, well, it's not illegal. So we just slam the container shut, reseal it and say, sucker, and move on. So so that's many, many years ago. CBSA is totally different now, I can tell you. But that's the reaction of the front end not being briefed on the typologies of trade-based money laundering.
Happens all the time. But the numbers, now this quote, quantity as a quality all its own, is one of my favorites. It is attributed to lots of different people, including Stalin, the former dictator of the Soviet Union.
Ross, you're always quoting Stalin. It's getting weird.
I know, but, and of course, Stalin killed more people than Hitler did. I told my daughters, who were a Jewish family, that if there was a Holocaust museum in Washington for the Stalin executions and prison camps and the Ukraine starvation, that it would be 2 or 3 or 5 times the size of the Holocaust Museum for the Jewish Holocaust in Nazi Germany. We're talking.
Personally, I think that's right.
Just huge numbers. I digress, but it's a good story. I actually met a man who was at Yalta as a naval officer. My brother called me and said, go visit this guy. He's in his 80s. He's not going to live forever, in an apartment in New York. And I went to visit him, Julius Edelstein. And on the wall, he had a black and white picture of Yalta, the famous picture of Roosevelt, Stalin, and Churchill. And I said to him, why do you have this picture? Oh, Mr. Edelstein was there at Yalta. I said, did you meet Stalin? He said, of course. I said, what was he like? Oh, very nice guy.
That's what makes him so terrifying.
Well, he was nice because he needed Churchill and Roosevelt. So to get back, the volume of trade is huge, 500 million containers, circulating. That doesn't mean there are 500 million containers. It means that there are 500 million containers circulating. This is UNODC statistics. And that's, I mean, the pandemic has caused that number to be lower than normal. So the over 500 million, I think it's a pretty good guess. As Kim said, less than 5%, probably less than 1%, probably way less than 1%, because it interrupts the flow of trade to stop and look at a container. We're getting some great comments, but that's okay. And then, of course, to pay for the imports and exports, millions of wires, and nobody has time to look at those either. The SWIFT codes, the SWIFT messages rather, have very short descriptions, but again, those are easy to falsify. And then you can also transfer money outside of a bank using Hawala, using money transmitters like Western Union, PayPal. You can use cash couriers and bring the cash across borders, and you can use cryptocurrency transactions. Kim, you've worked at large banks. Do they look at those individual wires very closely?
Well, this is where you have to be very careful, is because open account trade is settled by payments from individuals to individuals, or corporates to corporates, or corporates to, or individuals to corporates.
Right.
And that's done through SWIFT MT103, and MT103s are generally vacuumed into payment transaction processing, anti-money laundering, transaction monitoring software. And that's all good, but letters of credit and documentary collections, et cetera, are settled via MT202s. And so a financial institution's payment screening may not include MT202s that are interbank transfers. So one of the reasons why trade-based money laundering is so effective, if you look at the Canadian example, MT103s are specifically written into the Proceeds of Crime, Money Laundering and Terrorist Financing Act as requiring transaction monitoring. Great, so there's open account trade. But for trade finance and traditional trade finance, the 202s are not. So if I'm a money launderer and I don't want my payments flowing into FinTrack, I will choose a letter of credit, because I know that 202 will not be reported into FinTrack unless a bank has flagged it as suspicious. So something to think about.
I agree. And we haven't really talked much about open account yet, but let's talk about it now. Open account, the account that we're referring to is not at a bank. Open account means the exporter and the importer trust each other enough not to demand payment in advance through a letter of credit, or a guarantee of payment through a letter of credit, that they have an ongoing relationship, and therefore on their account, their two accounts of the exporter and importer, they are they're sending money back and forth. So there's no bank financing, no trade finance transaction. We have a comment here. I guess we shouldn't read the name of the commentator, but I really like, which is, there are no worldwide customs standards. It's all country to country. Well, why not? Why aren't there worldwide customs standards?
Well, hang on. There's UCP, Universal Customs Practices, that are set out by, oh God, who do they put it out by? International Chamber of Commerce. So there are some customs standards, but it's done voluntarily. There are not sanctions against those who don't follow them, and different countries have different rules and regulations. So on the one hand, there are certain customs standards that everyone adheres to or tries to adhere to, but the customs experience will be different in country Y than it will be in country X. And professional money launderers learn to arbitrage those differences to their advantage. And that's what's important to remember, that the professional money launderer is gaming the system in order to gain advantage to either transmit or receive the proceeds of crime in a heavily camouflaged environment.
Oh, there was a question, does open account trading still exist?
Oh, yes.
Difficult, absolutely. About 80% of international trade, wouldn't you say, Kim? 80%.
I'd say more.
Okay, good. So why do I have this slide, known as the Hindenburg disaster? That some of you oldsters, people my age, will remember it as the cover of the eponymous Led Zeppelin album, the first Led Zeppelin album, 1969.
Ross, isn't that a reference to My First Marriage?
Eponymous or Led
No,
Zeppelin?
the Hindenburg.
I hope not, Kim.
Okay.
The reason I have this slide is, yes, I remember that album fondly, but it's because, and yes, my parents talked about the Hindenburg disaster and the way we talk about mass casualty events now, because I grew up in the 50s and this was 1937, and there's a famous radio announcer who is describing what's going on as it's going on, and he starts to cry. It's worth listening to. But the reason is you can see the compliance failure burning from miles away. It's not a surprise. So trade-based money laundering is one massive compliance burn. We've talked a little bit about trade finance, letters of credit. Kim mentioned standby LCs, which are another type of guarantee. It could be a loan to the company to export or import of goods. It could be pre-export financing to buy the materials and resources to create the goods. It could be the collections process, drafts issued by LCs of other banks. This is a curious thing that I learned from a client. It doesn't make a lot of economic sense, but banks, as a favor to their clients, will pay drafts issued by other banks, drafts under LCs issued by other banks. Well, I said to the client, it's a major international bank, why do you do this? You can't be making any money on it. Oh, they lose money on it. They're not making any money on it, but it's something they do for clients. But
hold on. There's another reason too.
Okay.
And that is if a bank is able to gather the whole credit bill negotiated, so the settlement of the LC, the fees, and the interest, if it's a usance LC, are tremendously profitable for banks. Trade finance on a risk-adjusted basis is one of the most profitable products and products sold by a financial institution. So what you do is you bait negotiation of certain bills of exchange as part of gathering the processing of the entire transaction, and on a risk-adjusted basis, the final CBN, credit bill negotiated, is extremely profitable. So in trade finance, there are certain rules and conventions that seem odd when you first look at them, but there's good reason for them.
Okay, great. So one of the problems, though, with an LC that's magnified by the payment of a draft of an LC issued by another bank. With an LC, typically the bank will only know its own customer. If it's issuing the LC, if it's confirming or advising the LC that the LC has been issued by a bank in another country, for example, it won't know either either side of the transaction. And if it's paying a draft issued, it won't know either side of the transaction. It won't know the parties. So, and very hard to do customer due diligence, CDD or EDD, enhanced due diligence in this case, because you just have a name. You may have a company, you may not. Name may be very common. So,
yes, but there's an important distinction to make here too, Ross, if I may.
Please.
And that is that financial institutions can see a part of the transaction or can see the entire transaction. If it's a letter of credit that's issued by HSBC in Canada in favor of a beneficiary in China for a shipment of goods that leaves Shanghai and arrives in Vancouver, and HSBC is the bank for the exporter, that entire transaction is captured by one bank. However, within traditional trade finance, you can have an issuing bank for the letter of credit, an advising bank that tells the exporter that a letter of credit has been opened in their favor. You can have a second advising bank You can have a negotiating bank, a reimbursement bank, a second reimbursing bank. There's a whole chain of different roles that different financial institutions can play. And as a result, if your bank only sees one small sliver of that, it's difficult to garner an appreciation for the full context of that transaction. So the difficulty is in the ability to use the information that the bank has at the time, whether it's the entire thing or a small slice, and to put that through a risk process that makes sense. Now, that's one of the things that professional money launderers will play with to ensure that throughout a transaction that it's broken up, in that one bank won't see the entirety, that it's fragmented as much as possible, because then you reduce the probability of someone piecing it all together and going, that doesn't pass the smell test. Sorry, Ross.
Exactly. Well said, Kim. Yes, and we have some comments to that effect. And even worse, even with a letter of credit, even when the issuing bank knows the customer, they might not know much about the transaction, if anything. They might not see the contract. They'll see an invoice and a bill of lading, but they won't see the contract necessarily. And then, of course, they're only looking at documents. They don't know what's in the container. They don't know if any of these TBML processes are being used, such as under invoicing or over invoicing or false invoicing or phantom invoice. They won't know that.
Yes, and to that point, Ross, if I may, they use inspection companies. So an inspection company like SGS International will be called in to inspect the goods ex factory when it leaves the factory, to inspect the goods before it goes onto the container ship, to inspect the goods in accordance with a list of criteria that's set out within the letter of credit. But calling an inspection company into the transaction is up to either the importer or the exporter. The bank can't really force that. There are ways a bank can say, well, we'll only provide you financing upon inspection. But generally speaking, it's up to the importer or the exporter. So if the inspection company is SGS International, which is the biggest firm, it's a Swiss firm, they do a tremendous job. They can be relied upon unless the documentation is forged. But if the inspection company is the happy-go-lucky, good fortune inspection company of Kowloon in Hong Kong that has a website produced by a 12-year-old, you might want to take another look at it, because the inspection company might be a sham. And in certain types of goods and transactions, there's always an inspection certificate to prove quality, quantity, etc. You know, foodstuffs, commodities, inspection certificates are extremely important. And sometimes it's the lack of an inspection certificate that can be a red flag. So if you have a commodity stream of transactions where inspection certificates are called upon time and time again, and then one transaction, there is no inspection certificate, that's a red flag. It's the old Sherlock Holmes, where Holmes says, what about the barking dog, Watson? And Watson says, but Holmes, there was no barking dog. And Holmes says, exactly. So it's not just the presence of red flags within trade-based money laundering, but it's the absence of certain things that can be red flags as well.
If I may add as well, Ross and Kim, I think as well the challenge for a lot of compliance officers is that if they're dealing with the invoices and they are seeing the papers and documentation about the price of the goods, there are no indexes available to compare those numbers, you know, to a system or an index that could show what is normal, what is a range of normal for that good. Some of the items, I think, on the list of the shipment, it can make sense, but there are many, for example, if there is raw materials or anything in that shipment, the price of that, it could be an issue, and it can be something that it would be problematic for compliance officers, you know, to compare to and see that if that is a red flag or if it's not.
Yes, well, so
Yes.
some banks have software from certain companies that allows them to track pricing of particular goods that are common to that corporate bank. So when I worked in Hong Kong for Standard Chartered. I worked for the textiles and garments unit, and we had a pretty good idea of what was the price of cotton, what was the price of certain components, what was the price of certain finished goods. And so if you have a professional money launderer that comes in and says, okay, well, these t-shirts are valued at $200 each, that's a real problem. And that becomes obvious. But then if they're valued at $50 each, well, they better be good quality t-shirts. So that's less common and more difficult to detect. And so what you find is the professional money launderers don't double or triple the price for over invoicing. The smart ones will make it bump up within a reasonable range of 1 or 2 standard deviations from the norm, and then use the volume to achieve their goal. The idiots are the ones who jack up the price or slash it to 0, put one transaction through, hoping that it'll, run the gauntlet and get through the compliance function. So you have to be careful. Over invoicing and under invoicing, if done effectively, is very, very difficult to detect, because if it's over invoice, is that price gouging or is it money laundering? Is it under invoice? Is it a hell of a good deal? Was it a fire sale? Was it 40% off? Or is it under pricing? So it's got to do with the industry, the products, the clients, so many other elements of the transaction.
Absolutely.
Both Suzanne and Kim made slightly different points, but they're both accurate. Yes, as Suzanne said, very difficult to know the price of commodities, impossible to know the price of products. Is it a volume deal where the exporter and importer have been dealing with each other for years and therefore the prices are low because the volumes are high? Or is it an example of underpricing? I've used the databases that are available. There's one in particular that's available that keys off of US imports and exports. The problem with it, and I used it with a bank that did a test run of the database. And the problem was a lot of the products didn't fit the database. You get an invoice that said equipment for airplane GPS, but was it an Airbus 380, the largest airplane made, or was it a Piper Cub, one of the smallest? It wasn't clear. You didn't have enough information. Kim?
Well, yeah, exactly. Price, and okay, so if you're going to over invoice or under invoice, don't choose gold or oil, where you pick up a smartphone and find out the global spot price in an instant. Use a piece of industrial machinery, part 16302B, valued at $4,922.63, that over invoiced, under invoiced, or priced just right. You have 30 seconds. And if you go out onto a trade finance floor, you'll find people desperately trying to figure out whether the pricing of the underlying goods makes sense or not. And regulators who are poorly informed on trade-based money laundering hold banks to account to say, you should know what is a reasonable price for the underlying goods. And that's not fair. If the price is $1 for a full shipment of iron ore, that's probably under invoicing. So it's a risk-based approach, right? You've got to use your head, train your people. And if something comes along that's so egregious, you can raise the red flag. But then if something comes along where it just seems a bit odd, and in combination with other red flags or indicators, that then becomes justification enough to raise the red flag and pursue a more in-depth examination of either the transaction or the players or both.
But as you said, Kim, the banks only have 30 seconds to look at all this because they have so many transactions, and the 30 seconds might be high. I want to get to the comments and questions briefly because we have a lot about Hawala. Is the whole point of Hawala the lack of financial tracking and privacy? No. There's another commentator that I think got it right, which is it's cheaper, faster. Yes, there's no KYC or CDD, but it's been around for centuries. It works. It's
But it's okay. So hawaladars who serve various communities around the world for person-to-person payments and trade transactions, they'll know their clients more intimately than a bank. They'll be faster than a bank. They'll be less expensive than a bank. They may not be more widely accepted than a bank in certain environments, but it is a concern because you're a lot you're more probable to get a trade transaction through a hawala in certain parts of the world than you are through financial institutions with Swift BIC codes.
okay. So the point though is that hawala is being used to pay for a transaction. It's not being created by TBML.
Correct.
The transaction may exhibit symptoms of TBML or not. The hawala is just a payment method. Same true with cryptocurrency. A lot of discussion of the Bitcoin blockchain. Yes, it's public. Yes, you can trace payments, but you don't know what they're for. So you have to link the payment, a cryptocurrency payment, to a trade transaction. Good luck. After the fact in investigation, maybe, but not necessarily. So we've still got a lot to do. Just a little bit about terminology. I happen to be pedantic about the use of terminology. Customer due diligence is the international term, is the term used in the US, is the defined term. I don't know about Canada or the other countries represented, but if the countries, I used to know about Afghanistan because I helped write the anti-money laundering law, but it was eventually redrafted. We didn't use the term KYC because it does not exist internationally. Yes, banks use it, but CDD is defined and the US definition is very close to the international definition. Enhanced due diligence, the same. E2D2 is not a term you're going to hear. I use it because a client invented it and I like it. And this is boots on the ground, getting over to look at the factory, to talk to people in the town, in the city, in the village. Who is this person? Who is this company? Are they for real? And KYCC, know your customer's customer, is used a lot when it comes to trade transactions. So just some definitions. And yes, these really are my grandchildren. High risk products, services, geographies, customers. We've talked about this. We're gonna go to some actual examples now because it's more fun. So why are used cars, and Kim and Suzanne, I don't want you to answer this. Why are used cars such a great way to launder money through TBML? Does anybody want to hazard a guess through the chat box? Valuation, yes. Cars can vary in value, yes. But why used cars? New cars have valuation issues, don't they? Well, actually, they don't. Value is subjective, yes. New cars have a sticker price. New cars do have some slight variations with the sticker price, but the sticker price is known. Used cars, you've got all sorts of variations, things like mileage, condition of the car, age, maintenance. Has the car been in an accident? Yeah, the slides will be shared, so don't worry, don't take notes. I don't want you to take notes, I want you to listen. You can take notes later. So that's used cars. They're one of the biggest cases that we know about because most of this, now somebody read my slides and I really don't like it when you read the slides ahead and they said used cars have lots of empty spaces to fill with various possibly valuable substances. Yes, that's actually very, very true. Narcotics, money, precious metals, but do not read ahead, okay? Suzanne, can we discourage that in future presentations? Okay, but seriously, folks, the Lebanese Canadian bank case is worth looking at. It is an American case involving a Lebanese bank where Hezbollah in Lebanon, the terrorist group, and the Zetas, then one of the most vicious narco cartels, actually got together like one of those James Bond movies where all the bad people, the bad guys, men and women, are in one room around a big table. Well, the difference is this was guys from Hezbollah with beards, and the Zetas in Mexico. I don't know if they have beards or not. And they were different languages, different cultures, different religions, and they're cooperating about money laundering. So maybe once in a while, fiction is accurate. So that's used cars. Gold, Kim has talked about. Gold does have fairly fixed prices, but it's not always clear what kind of gold we're talking about.
Well, Ross, if I can jump in there,
Please, John.
there are cases where gold bars are being painted black to make them look like clumps of iron.
Yes.
So gold is very effective. In that case, it's more a smuggling than trade-based money laundering, but the smuggling is for the purpose of laundering the proceeds of crime. So that's interesting. But also gold, there was La Mina, a fantastic money laundering case that came about in the 90s or the 80s. And it was gold exports from Uruguay. And within the FBI office in Atlanta, I believe, the officers were discussing the fact that all these gold exports from Uruguay were flooding the American market, and used as justification for sending payments down into Latin America. And as these senior FBI agents are talking amongst themselves about gold being mined in Uruguay, there was a snicker of laughter from an intern, maybe a summer student. And they said, "What the hell are you laughing at?" And the intern said, "I'm a geology student. There's no gold in Uruguay." And so that right there was a massive red flag. And as a result, they looked into the actual physical shipments, and it wasn't gold that was being sent up. It was cast iron, but the weight was there and it was painted gold. So it looked good, justified payments flooding out of the United States and heading to Latin America. But in fact, it wasn't gold. So there you go.
I do want to respond to Michael, who said he wasn't reading ahead. He just knew about it. And Michael, I was kidding. I'm sorry if it wasn't clear. So, and Suzanne has said that there are a lot of smart people in the room. Suzanne, I want to correct that in future presentations, okay? Let's make sure we get more inexperienced people. OFAC sanctions, yes, there's nothing specific about OFAC that relates to TBML that I'm aware of, except when it comes to trade finance, all of the parties need to be run through sanction screening, even if it's not your customer. So that's the OFAC take on it. But all sorts of issues with evading sanctions through gold. A major case in the US right now about that, specifically using gold to evade Iranian sanctions. Gold, though, lots of advantages, but some disadvantages too, because different types. So hard to value. Is it pure gold? Is it jewelry? Is it gold plating for electronics? Is it scrap gold? All have different prices. Do the parties specialize in gold trading? There is also, it's very tough to figure out whether the countries make sense. Kim talked about Uruguay, but if you look at this list of countries, gold exporters are some of the same countries that are major gold producing countries. That makes sense. But importers are on the same list as the producing countries. So why is that? Because we're talking about jewelry. We're talking about gold that has been reformed in some way. So a tricky area. Luckily, I have access to talk to Mike Reese, who's at least in the U.S. is the leading precious metals and AML person, and he explains a lot of this stuff to me. And I include charcoal because it's anything. It could be anything that trade-based money laundering is used for, or financing of terrorism, or other bad things. So charcoal trafficking by Al-Shabaab, a particularly vicious terrorist group in Somalia, very large numbers given the very poor country, and creating an environmental disaster in Somalia because the charcoal is made from acacia trees. People in the Middle East love acacia charcoal to roast the food that they eat, and therefore it's prized, and eventually there'll be no acacia trees left in Somalia. But it can be something as modest as charcoal that is supporting terrorism or other things. So yes, you've got a lot to do here when it comes to customer due diligence. But certain types of things, used cars would be very high on the list. You see used cars going to a strange place, West Africa in the case of the Lebanese Canadian bank prosecution. Why so many used cars to one of the poorest areas in the world? And there would be a lot of questions there, or should have been. Kim, anything?
Well, yeah, but also within reason. Used cars from North America being sent to China is a huge business. Used cars from Japan to various countries in Southeast Asia, such as Indonesia, is a huge business, because used cars have a certain length of usage within Japan, and then after they age to a certain point, they're extremely expensive to maintain, not just from the parts, but the taxes go up because the Japanese government wants newer cars with more efficient engines on the road to reduce pollution. So all those used cars get shipped into other countries. And so you have huge flows of used cars from country X to country Y as a matter of tradition. So you have to know why those flows exist in the first place in order to determine whether or not something is potentially suspicious.
Absolutely right. And yes, poor people drive cars too, but really poor people in places like Niamey, Niger, or Blantyre, Malawi that I've been to didn't see much traffic, I'll have to say.
Yeah.
So we're switching gears a little bit because we're talking about the pandemic. Yes, this is my granddaughter, Eleanor. And PPEs, of course, personal protective equipment include masks, gloves, and gowns. This is a cape. It's not really a gown, but it's as close as I could get. So a little bit about fraud. I want to see how we're doing for time. I think we're doing pretty well. Although we do have a lot of questions, Suzanne, so maybe we should, do you want to stop or keep going?
If we can keep going, I will keep the questions till the end.
Okay. Well, we're not going to talk about all these types of fraud. You'll get the deck. We're going to head to TBML in a minute. But the main point about the pandemic and the linkage to TBML is price gyrations. The price of oil falling below zero. Sellers had to pay buyers to take the oil. I mean, that doesn't happen very often. I'm not sure it's ever happened in the US. And then there's panic buying, driving up basic foodstuffs, wheat, rice, eggs. And then there are shortages that are driving up prices of PPEs, like N95 masks. So all of this is a money launderer's heaven because no one knows what the prices are. They're changing minute by minute for things that were very inexpensive, like N95 masks, all of a sudden very rare and hard to get. And then the price goes up, but how high does it go and what's normal? So we're going to skip over the other types of fraud, even though I like the term, that's my youngest grandchild, Beatrix. I like the term stockpile fraud because a colleague of mine who helped me write an article about pandemic fraud invented it, Stephen Walls, and it's somebody with a secret source of N95 masks that nobody else has. You got to ask a lot of questions. You're a car dealer. Why is it that you're now trafficking in N95 masks? How do you get them when no one else can find them? So we're not going to skip. We're going to skip over, even though it's a lot of fun. This is Charlie's first solid food, carrots, which he managed to get some of it in his mouth, I think. Let's go to TBML because that's our. So the price fluctuations allow shifting of prices. Kim talked about how hard it is to figure out what the right price is. And again, perfect. Do we have specific examples of TBML in the pandemic using N95s? No. Do I know it's happening? Absolutely. Are there examples of fraud with N95 masks and corruption? Those are documented, including in places like El Salvador. Kim?
Well, I would also discuss the fact that pricing volatility has been tremendous within international trade during the pandemic. When the pandemic first started, the prices of certain goods skyrocketed. The price of international shipping went through the floor. And then in the summer of 2020, there was a reversal. Price of goods in some areas became more stable, and shipping costs went through the roof because of a shortage of container routes. So it's a volatility. So as prices go increasingly volatile, the professional money launderers will use over-invoicing and under-invoicing to maximize their utility of trade-based money laundering. If volatility is flat, like in 2019, the economies of most countries around the world were stable, they were growing at a stable rate, everything was fairly predictable. And in those environments, it's very hard to manipulate pricing. So trade-based money laundering using volumes or descriptions is a lot more efficient. So volatility is key to money laundering, because within that volatility, the professional money launderers can begin to insert their transactions, and it looks just as crazy as everything else going on, because the number one goal of a professional money launderer is camouflage. You camouflage the laundering of the illicit proceeds of crime within the larger context of transactional flows between countries.
Well said, Kim. So
Thank you.
that's, yes. So I think you said it all. Quickly about red flags. I call my older daughter Rachel. She's has a PhD in biology, which is relevant to the story. I need the kids waving red flags. This is what she sends me. I call up Rachel. Rachel, these are orange flags. Yes, Dad, this is all we had. Now, the point here is something that I think Kim and Suzanne both talked about. It's impossible for banks to figure this out. It's impossible just looking at documents. These are the red flags that the FFIC manual, which is issued by banking regulators in the US, and the manual that the examiners called inspectors in other countries use, it's public. These are the red flags that are distributed, but the problem is, uh-oh, it's doing this again. Yeah. Well, I'm not sure why this happens, but I've had this issue with other presentations as well. So obvious over under pricing, yes, but it's usually not obvious. Significant discrepancies, yes, but and this is from the FATF in 2006. We have links to these main documents.
But can I interject here?
Yeah.
So this is where the FATF departs from reality. Discrepant documents in international trade are common. I've worked in trade finance in Hong Kong, and 80% of letter of credit transactions contain discrepant documents. And the discrepancies are crossed T's or dotted I's, or descriptions, pricing, volumes, etc. Even the smallest discrepancy can be noted. And then banks will waive those discrepancies on the basis of understanding their client, or will go to their client and say, do you waive the following discrepancies? So that's a matter of course for the regular flow of business. And then the FATF steps in and says, well, significant discrepancies. And then the people in trade finance operations look at it and go, what are you talking about? Discrepancies are everywhere. Why would it be significant discrepancies? So careful for what the FATF and Egmont and all these others do when they make grand proclamations about international trade and what to detect. Never forget that OSFI, Canada's banking regulator, and its B8 guideline years ago said that all international trade is high risk for money laundering, which is total nonsense. That doesn't make any sense whatsoever. laundering money through wall chain supply chain finance network would be an absolute nightmare for any professional money laundering. And so that is not high risk. So you have to be careful for when the regulators stand there and start pointing fingers versus practical knowledge in the line of business that banks will have exposure to because their own staff are in trade finance operations or in relationship management or the payment center. Go to those people too. It's really important that you utilize the resources within the bank to understand the risks involved and not just default to what the FATF or OSFI says, et cetera. It has to be weighed within reality.
Absolutely right. So the red flags are not that useful, and you can look at these yourselves later. So I came up with a proposal which no one likes, which is that everybody in the supply chain should adopt an AML program and file SARs and STRs. But interestingly, for the first time, the FATF, I came up with this proposal about 8 or 9 years ago. The FATF just tiptoed close to it in its December 2020 guidance when it talked about how freight forwarders should look at AML issues more closely, and authorities should cooperate with freight forwarders. Well, yeah, but it can't be voluntary. It has to be required. So lots of risk factors, practical solutions, call somebody up. If you have a question about PPEs or commodities, call up a dealer and say, is this normal? And they might say to you something like, oh, you must have it wrong. That's, you've got somebody buying PPEs in China, and China's a major manufacturer. So are you sure you're right about that? Well, yeah, I'm looking at the transaction. I know I'm right. So that's lots of CDD is required, and you've got Google and you've got ways to do that. Kim, do you want to talk about this now? Suzanne, I don't know.
Yeah, we ManchesterCF produces the financial intelligence specialist designation. Part of that program is a course called FIU Connects Trade-Based Money Laundering. We've been instructing on TBML since 2007, and what you see on screen on the right are the digital badges that you get for your LinkedIn profile. They're produced by Credly. And if you pass these courses and sign up for the FIS Plus program, these digital badges can be on your LinkedIn profile. So check out manchestercf.com for further information. Also check out my LinkedIn profile to see examples of those digital badges. And I also posted a sample of the TBML textbook onto LinkedIn earlier this morning for those that want to see more information about it. So there you go.
That's amazing. Thank you, Kim and Ross. And I think one of your suggestions that Ross, you mentioned, which I really attest to, that is the training and the training of many of the compliance people who are working in the TBML sections, and they are looking at the trade financing. And as we could have seen, many of those trainings and many of the regulators as well point out that majority of these trainings are generic, and they are about money laundering, and they just talk about basic money laundering typologies. But for the people or the compliance professionals who are working in the trade finance, they need to have a specialized training that talks about all the red flags, give them a bit depth about what should they look for, what are the importance of the review that they are doing, and what actually they should be looking for. And we really have like myself, when I was in Dubai and Middle East, we really had that lack, that we didn't have specialized content that could attest to the risk of money laundering in trade-based, and that was a huge problem. And thanks, Kim, for designing that and creating something really special for the community. And we have a great news for the people that stay in the session. after we go through some of the questions, we are gonna do a raffle draw on the people who they are in the session and they didn't leave and stayed with us till the end. We're gonna give away a FIS certificate, and thanks for Kim for sponsoring that and giving an opportunity for someone within us to go through and complete this amazing certification. So stay tuned. We're gonna just go through a couple of questions, Ross and Kim, if that's okay with you.
Sure.
And then we can do a raffle draw at the end.
Absolutely. Let's do it. We have questions for all of your answers. Yes.
Awesome. So the first question is, what role will illegal wildlife and slave trade play in TBML? Can you a bit highlight on that?
That's Kim.
So wildlife, we have a course on wildlife trafficking. We released that in the summer of 2020. We came across the use of wildlife trafficking components for trade-based money laundering. I would consider wildlife trafficking to be a separate issue on its own because it involves endangered species, poaching. I would segregate it into its own categorization. And for human trafficking, same thing. You can't really use people for trade-based money laundering. Human trafficking is a predicate offense all to its own. Trade-based money laundering is best summarized as people being very clever in shifting value across borders. And that's the way to frame it. The wildlife trafficking payments that are made for ivory, that are made for different animal components, those payments can be camouflaged using trade-based money laundering. The revenues generated from human trafficking, that revenue heading back to a central focal point can be sent via trade-based money laundering transaction. So TBML is an added component to wildlife trafficking, to human trafficking. That's the way I'd view it.
Suzanne?
Great, perfect. Thanks, Kim, for that. Another question that came in is, does accepting all discrepancies ahead of sending documentations raise any flags? Some suppliers accept discrepancies ahead of sending documents to ensure they get paid ASAP.
Yes. Yes, so they do that. And does it raise red flags? No, because the number one goal for the exporter is to get paid. So in certain circumstances, they'll issue a blanket acceptance of discrepancies. And that makes sense, because if an entire trade transaction is being held up because somebody didn't dot a letter I, that's ridiculous. But if the discrepancies are, well, we ordered 12 pink Cadillacs and instead you sent us 3 goats, that's a big one, and that makes no sense. So you have to use your head. So blanket acceptance of discrepancies makes sense for trade transactions that are held up for the smallest of issues. But for big issues, to do blanket acceptance kind of defeats the purpose of a letter of credit in the first place. So that's a red flag.
Awesome. Perfect. I think this is a question that I had as well for myself. So what is your opinion about future of TBML? Will it be substantially different from today in, let's say, in 2040? What major changes and trends you anticipate, to see in the next 20 years?
2040?
Yeah.
Really?
Well, I
in 2019, I
then,
thought
so
2020 was going to be the best year ever. Oops, I was a little wrong. 2020, I thought 2021 would be fantastic. We'd be all past this craziness. Oops, I was a little wrong.
Well, if I can attempt an answer, there's been discussion in the the chat box about cryptocurrency and smart contracts. That doesn't change anything. a smart contract is great, that it's on a blockchain somewhere and maybe it's public or maybe it's not. Just because it's on a blockchain doesn't mean it's public. It could be a private blockchain just between a large importer, exporter, and its suppliers. So that in and of itself doesn't change anything. Smart contracts, again, just another format, but that doesn't prevent fraud or money laundering. Fraud or money laundering will be with us. I predict if there are humans centuries from now, we don't know that given the way we treat each other, there will be fraud and money laundering and all the bad things. And yeah, maybe they'll call it different things. TBML never seriously addressed by the FATF, even though December 2020, they come out with this report. Kim and I just read it. And gee whiz, where's the meat? Where's the beef? There should be more cooperation between countries, private public partnerships.
Who knew?
That's a snoozer. That just doesn't do very much. Kim?
Well, I mean, it's kind of like saying, if it rains, we've done extensive research and we found that you should use an umbrella. That is our conclusion. Everyone stop the presses. Letters of credit have been around since the 18th century. They're still going to be around. That's how banks insert themselves into trade transactional risk. And so they'll continue. And as long as they continue and money laundering continues, it'll be TBML. And then in comes the whole blockchain brigade and says, we're going to change everything. Everything's going to be totally different. It's all going to be smart contracts and blockchain transactions. Banks are boasting that they've completed certain blockchain transactions related to trade. Terrific. Great. So very sophisticated trading companies and manufacturers who have access to millions of dollars in R&D and banking relationships that have banks falling over themselves to serve those companies. Yeah, they can play around with blockchain and they'll do good things with it. Terrific. So that's the top tier. But then there's the bottom. There's the rest of it. There's the small, medium-sized enterprises that are engaging in international trade. And at what point in time do you leap from doing traditional trade finance to blockchain, whiz-bang, smartphone-enabled, makes coffee too type of transactions at the drop of a hat? It doesn't happen like that. So traditional trade finance will still exist. Open account trade will still exist using traditional methods. Blockchain, I mean, it's marvelous. We have a course on crypto assets. Spent a lot of money developing it, but it doesn't revolutionize the world in every corner. So yes, it is a concern within trade-based money laundering, but it's not the big concern. The big concern is the same level of risk that's been in existence for decades and decades, which is people using international trade to send and receive value without anyone ever figuring it out. And that's where we need to focus our attention. I'd much prefer that we focus on learning how to walk before we can run. And I get worried that we're getting detracted from reality by looking at blockchain transactions being promoted by individuals on stage with rock music and flashing lights behind them saying, look over here, this is the big thing. Careful about that.
If I could just add to that, Kim, again, well said. The FATF is really not helping us here. They've come to an international consensus on all sorts of difficult issues. They've left TBML alone. I actually asked the former executive secretary about that. I had some time alone with him because we teach a course together and didn't have a good answer. We just didn't get to it. Well, it's been around, recognized by the FATF for 30 years. What do you mean you didn't get around to it? What else did you get around to that was more important? And yet, why identify it as one of the three main avenues of money laundering if you're not going to do anything about it? At least try to hide it a little bit. So 2040, I think it's a good question. I agree with Kim, no major changes. Cryptocurrency is great, except it's a faster rate of transmission than fiat currency. So yeah, it's nice that there's a blockchain somewhere and you can track the the cryptocurrency transaction, that doesn't mean you can track the trade transaction or link the two in any meaningful way. Suzanne?
Yeah. I have seen, I think it was last year, that around 14 different banks I think in Singapore, they have tried to go in a testing for a blockchain system so that they can use it as a registry for the trade-based or trade finance, transactions. And that has could be perhaps, a start of something. What are your thoughts around it? Do you think that there would be a hope that at least if FATF or other institutions are not doing it, how about banks? What can banks do with technology, with the use of technology, in order to make an effect on TBML?
Well, you have to be very, very careful here. Trade finance itself is not automated. A letter of credit can be 3 pages long or involve half an inch thick worth of documents for one drawing. So try and automate that process, because you have to automate that process to automate the detection of patterns of things going wrong. You have an automated trade, so you have an automated TBML. There are also a lot of software vendors that advertise, if you press this button, this computer will print out a whole list of your TBML risks. So please buy this button. It costs you $10 million, but act now and you'll save $1.99. It's nonsense. Trade-based money laundering is detected by 2 components. One is the human element. The second is technology within certain limits. But the human element is the one that can detect the patterns of what doesn't pass the smell test. And that's why we built our training courses. Because within trade finance processing, there's a lot of human intervention. Even today, if you go into a major international bank, whether in Canada or elsewhere, and make no mistake, banks in Canada are not at the cutting edge of trade finance. They really, really aren't. And so when you walk into a trade finance operations at a Canadian bank, you're looking at mountains and mountains of paper everywhere being processed by individuals with years and years of experience. So training those individuals to spot a rat or smell a rat is absolutely critical, in conjunction with intelligent use of technology. I was sitting in front of one trade clerk in Toronto, and he was lamenting the fact that every time a bank involved in the transaction, it gets inserted into a data field, this little window pops up and it says, alert, potential risk of money laundering. Please investigate. And it would pop up, and he knew the keyboard functions to make it go away right away, because the bank that was being referenced had a term in that bank that was similar to a bank that had been sanctioned. And so he was in the habit of dismissing all the alerts that came through because they were so regimented and so overwhelming that they had no utility. So when banks come together and say, yeah, we're gonna invent technology that solves the problem, run.
Well,
I worked for a bank that walked away from a technology project that cost them 33 million pounds.
If I could just add to that, Kim, I'm working with an international client who was it had been criticized by the regulators, so trying to beef up its trade finance procedures to address TBML. And the thing that struck me about it was I was hired by the compliance people, but I was immediately sent to work with the trade finance people. Well, the trade finance people are not looking for money laundering red flags. They're just not. And the compliance people are not understanding trade finance transactions, and they're on different floors. And just to underline something that Kim said, what I noticed in this big room filled with desks is that every desk had a stack of files on it, paper files. Yes, there was some of it was automated, but a lot of it was not. So you have siloing, and you have a lack of automation, and you've got a huge volume of transactions, and you've got containers that you can't look into and that nobody can. And that adds up to a problem that is not going away.
And
Design.
coupled with that is the pressure from the bank for productivity.
Yes,
Trade finance clerk sitting there and raising the red flag the whole time saying, this doesn't smell right, this doesn't smell right, this doesn't smell right. Pretty soon the manager is going to come over and say, look, Mr. Smith, you're holding us all up. Our productivity is dropping. You need to be a little more judicious in raising the red flag. So you have to balance those two.
yes.
And for any financial institution, that's very difficult. Now, I'll finish by saying this because we're running out of time. If you want to learn more about TBML and you work for a bank, get a tour of trade operations. Get a tour of how the sausage is made in the sausage factory. And there you'll really learn how difficult it is to spot TBML within the existing business. Because if you rely on PowerPoint as your source of knowledge for how trade operates, you're never going to get anywhere. Go to the coalface and see how it gets mined.
Thank you so much, Kim, and thank you so much, Ross. It was a very insightful and informative session. Thanks both for your time. Ross, can I please ask you to stop sharing your screen so I can share my wheel of names?
But before I do, I will just want to invite people to connect with me on LinkedIn if you liked it or if you didn't like it. Either way, connect with me on LinkedIn. Thanks, Suzanne.
Definitely, definitely. Please follow Ross and Kim. Ross always share informative information and his slides and presentations. So you will see the slides, I think, first on his LinkedIn before we send it off to everyone. And also Kim, he's amazing. He always share insightful information as well. So make sure that you follow both of them, and also ManchesterCF on as well on LinkedIn. So for the ones who stayed, and thank you so much for staying still with us, 5 minutes left. We are gonna go through a wheel of names. Everyone's name is listed here. So we're gonna go through and see that whoever is here, just put your name on the chat if you were the winner. So let's spin the wheel. Ashwin, do we have Ashwin in the house? Everyone for joining the session, and congratulations again, Ashwin. We will get back to you, Ashwin, on a separate email, and we will share the subscription for the FIS certificate, and congratulations again. And well done, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. And we will be sharing the recording of the session by end of today. And for those who register for the certificate, you will get the link for the certification by end of today. So thank you. Have a wonderful weekend and enjoy the rest of the day. And thanks again, Kim and Ross.
Thank you, Suzanne.
Thanks, Suzanne.
Thank you, Kim.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Ross.
Bye.